Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's video explores an alternate version of events and characters in a reimagined storyline. This presentation is structured and adopted into an audiobook style format with narration and visuals to enhance the experience. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the story.
Yaxley Wall. The earliest memory Niella of the Salt Cliffs had was from when she was 4 of her mother telling her that her father had died in the rebellion. She had no memory before this that she could recall and feel confident it was genuinely her memory, and not a memory that her mother had implanted in her own head through constant storytelling of her early years. It was from her mother that she had learned that they had not always lived in a one-room stone hut near the Salt Cliffs that lined the Salt Spear, but instead had once owned some land, not a lot of land, but some nonetheless, and sworn fealty to the Flints of Flint's Finger, who in turn swore fealty to House Stark of the North, whatever that meant. But then her father had died in the rebellion serving that said House Stark, and his younger brother, her uncle, had come and thrown out Niella and her mother and claimed the lands for himself. The Flints ignored her mother's pleas, saying if she really wanted her lands back, she would have to take them for herself. Niella had often asked why her uncle would be so sore to turn them out of house, and always her mother would brush her black hair aside and run her thumb against Niella's forehead, Niella feeling nothing from the lingering amount of grayscale that troubled her in her infancy, and say that some people in the world are never content with what they have, and always desire more. And the old gods see fit to give them more, my sweetling, more of death, her mother had always said, and Niella supposed it was true. For many a night she dreamed of having all her mother told her she deserved, praying each night before she fell asleep, that the old gods would give her her birthright, but the old gods were cruel, as her mother warned her. And at the tender age of 14 she had lost her mother to a sudden chill, which turned into an all-out fever from which she died. Remember the cliffs had been her mother's final words on earth. And Niella did remember the cliffs. The salt cliffs provided Niella the only way to trade open to her. Each day she climbed the cliffs to chip away a decent-sized block of salt to take to the village market, and earn the few meager coins that would see her through on food until the next day. She supplements this with whatever fish she can catch, though not many lived in the salty waters of the Salt Spear. It was one particularly fine morning, a day or two after the storms had ravaged the waters of the Salt Spear, that Nilla's life was about to change. She found a boy, in tattered clothing long ruined and soggy. To Nilla the boy was the handsomest she'd e'er seen. He had long black hair, and a long straight nose and strong jaw. He had obviously seen better days, for he looked nearly starved, pale, and rather gaunt. But when she held his hand in hers, she felt it to be warm. She drug him along the beach until they came to her hut, where she set about beginning to tend to the boy. He was barely alive, but she believed she could heal him. Her mother, in her earliest memories, had collected as many rare cures in her own vendetta against the gray curse that curved from her forehead down over to her right cheek, like a scythe. Nothing had really worked, but a collection of rare cure-alls had been the result of her endeavors. This led Nilla to try one of the stronger cures made from Hebrion's moss, that while available in Westeros, was much more common to Essos. Of all her attempts, this proved to be the most effective, and slowly the boy's fever subsided, and color began to return to his skin, giving him a slightly dark tone to his skin that she couldn't help but admire. During this time, she placed him upon her straw, wrapped him in her blankets, and held tightly to him as he slept, trying to imagine what it might be like if he were a husband, like Mother spoke of most men being for women. She called him Clef and spoke to him as he slept, imagining how he might respond. In her mind he was bold, but sweet, cunning, but kind, and had a quick mind to match such traits. When he woke she figured it would only be a matter of time until he left. They all were repelled by her gray scythe upon her face, and most everyone whom she came in contact with avoided meeting with her a second time, if they could because of those scales. However, the young man who awoke had no memory of who he had been. He remembered running and nearly drowning, but before that, nothing of his former life it seemed, and Nilla had to hope that it remained that way, for as long as he forgot his other life before she had rescued him, the longer she could keep him. He accepted the name Clive, believing that to lack a name would bring him misfortune of some kind, though he was unsure of what that was. Some days after he had just awoke, Natsla hated that he had to ruin the Clive she'd imagined he'd be. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined his occasional tendencies towards boastfulness and bragging, but then he would turn around and with the sweetest of black eyes be extremely kind to her. Natsala knew not what to make of the two very different Clives that he tended to switch between, but she encouraged the sweet young man just beginning to develop for herself. One night while she was rewrapping the few minor wounds, cuts and scrapes he called them, that he'd sustained on his bare chest, her hand paused for a moment longer than intended in one spot. He then looked at her, and then he took a kiss from her. It was rough and befitted the braggart Clive. She repelled his continued advance, and he challenged her on it. He looked her in the eye and said, "You want it? Admit it? I can see your desire in your eyes." "I do, but not like that," was her only reply on the subject. It was then that he tried again, being kinder this time and more hesitant, as though fearful of her rejection. And from that moment forward, both Clive and Nainel were quite satisfied with one another for many times to come over the next few days. For a time she imagined that he didn't flinch when he ran his hand over her grey scythe, and that he too wanted her as much she did him, and his continued kindness to her made it all the easier. Sadly though, like all good things, it came to an end sooner rather than later. Meera. She had been tracking them north, planning to only join up with them once they found a way past the wall. There'd be no sending her home after that. Josian had told her that Bran knew where to go to get to the three-eyed raven's cave, and that it was north of the wall. In an attempt to try and calm her down, when he and father had broken the news to her in an attempt to try and convince her that they'd be safe. All they had done was strengthen her resolve that she had to go. She knew why her brother placed his trust in the small wolf, but that still did not stop her from thinking it rather foolish. True, the boy was a powerful ward. She'd observed him attempting to teach Josian how to control a raven one afternoon in the Godswood, but that didn't change the fact that he still was but half her age. Her father could look after, but who would be there to help Josian? Her father knew her brother not as well as he thought. Though Josian and he may share that same quiet, thoughtful outer shell, underneath they couldn't be more different. Josian was more like mother, underneath constantly thinking and planning and worrying. Their father, meanwhile, put faith in the gods that had seen him through to this point and would continue to do so, almost blindly trusting that they would make everything right. But if there was one thing she had learned growing up in the dangerous marshes of the Neck, it was that you had to be on guard at all times if you wished to live. How her father had survived his infancy in the bog, Meera knew not. They had begun the journey north, Meera observed, by traveling through the Wolfswood just parallel to the King's Road, and Meera kept well enough of a distance away to keep an eye on them, but remain out of sight. Once Winterfell was a good 3 days' journey behind them. They then continued their journey along the King's Road, and for several weeks they traveled in this manner, not a soul disturbing them on the journey north. They'd travel during the mornings, spend the late afternoons hunting for game and the evenings eating, sharing stories of her father's time during Robert's Rebellion, that she overheard from her own meager little camps, him tell for the umpteenth time, but she watched as Rob's younger brother and his wolf pup listened with over-eager ears, lapping up all the stories as if they'd never heard the tales told. One night as they drew closer to the colder winds of the far north, she pondered what this meant. Had Lord Stark spoke not a word of Robert's rebellion to his children? That seemed rather odd to Meera, and she wondered if that might explain Rob's behavior a bit more. If he had a father who didn't tell him everything like she knew her father told her, then mightn't he be a tad more naive? And upon reaching that realization, Meera retired for the night, thankful for the father he had been given by the gods. When they passed Queen's Crown, the group began to journey further north by not taking the rest of the King's Road to Castle Black, instead veering more and more away from the road. Meera found she had to stay at an even larger distance from them in order to not be seen, as the lands upon the gift had been cleared for farmland centuries ago, though most of them were now fallow. In fact, it felt rather eerie traveling through the ruins of old farms where skeletal buildings and creaky old windmills groaned with the wind. One night she was staying in a ruin of a barn, the only building between her and the small hut her father-brother, the wolf pup, called Summer, and Bran Stark had occupied a few miles away, but still in sight across the empty moorland. That night, a frozen rain had fallen, making the necessity of a roof keep her from traveling to a place closer, as she didn't want to wake up to find herself half frozen under a sheet of ice. It also brought trouble that she had not anticipated. Meera had just been falling asleep when a sound was heard in the bottom floor of the barn. She'd found comfort enough in the half-rotten, but still softer than the ground, hayloft, and truly Meera didn't mind the moldy smell of the hay. The banging at first, Meera took for the fierce wind which plagued the gift, blowing open the barn door. This had already been the case earlier in the evening, and she'd already gone down to close it. However, just as she was about to climb down the rickety old ladder, she heard a voice of a man in the darkness proclaim, "This place smells worse than a snow bear's ass in summer." "What do you care how it smells like? You turning kneeler on us," Rickwile teased another man's voice. "Kneelers? What were those?" thought Mira. "Gods be good, you're the one who complains if he hasn't had a bath in a week," shouted the first man. "I did not risk dying climbing that frozen wall to hear you two argue. If I wanted that, I would have let the others take me long ago," interrupted a woman's voice. Mira felt her eyes widen. "Others? Well, who are live, dear? Sure got fancy built themselves a whole second hut atop this one," said a third man's voice. "Gods help me. They'll find me," panicked Mira, but she was too frozen with fear to move. "Have not they barns north o' wall?" asked a fourth man's voice. "What's a barn?" asked the third man. "Place where your animals sleep," said a fifth man. "That's what the ground's for," protested the voice called Rickwile. The third man added, "If this place is for the beasts, I'd like to see where you kneelers hole up." Mira finally had summoned the courage to back away slowly from the edge of the entrance to the loft. A board groaned beneath her weight. "Quiet," yelled the woman, who then ordered a man named Margos to climb the ladder. Mira knew she had no opportunity to remain hidden, the hay far too sodden and heavy to bury herself beneath, so she reached for her pronged spear. But as she grasped it, the old loft floorboards finally gave way, sending Mira crashing to the ground below. Once recovering from the impact, which she did relatively quickly, she tried thrashing her pronged spear aimlessly through the dark air. It was promptly knocked out of her hands. Before her she saw 5 shadowy figures. The voice called Margos exclaimed, "By the gods, I didn't know there were Southring spearwives." "She's not a spearwife, she's a Crannog girl," spat the fourth man. Mira felt a thin, gaunt hand caress her face and pull it towards where it had come from, while the fifth man said, "What you doing this far north of Nakdiri?" In a flash, she'd pulled her dagger and stabbed it in the direction the man's voice had come from. She heard a gasp, a burbling sound emanating from the man's direction, and heard him as he tried to say, "Sat, she's got a dagger." Mira knew she was outnumbered, but she put up a fight nonetheless, stabbing her dagger in the directions of the breathing and footsteps she heard, sometimes stabbing something, though not as mortally wounding as her first victim, apparently, for the 5 remaining figures encircled her, and a pole eventually knocked against her wrist and she dropped the dagger in pain. She fell to her knees and grabbed her wrist with her free hand. She heard someone quickly scramble to grab her dagger, and before her hand had recovered, she felt her own dagger's point at her neck. She waited to feel it pulled across and end her life. "Stop!" shouted the woman's voice. "She killed Wallen," hissed the fourth man's voice from aside her. "We could ransom her," suggested the voice called Rickwile. "Crannog girls are worth next to nothing," proclaimed the voice in her ear. "There won't be any killing this night. Besides, I like her spirit," ordered the woman, who took the dagger from the fourth man's hand. "Rise, kneeler. I am no king," said the woman smugly. And Mira did as she was told, and Mira was crestfallen, knowing she had failed to help her brother, and she wondered who would be there to protect Jausen when wildlings took them as they had her. Yeatered. After receiving word from Callan that Theon had likely died fleeing Winterfell, drowning in a flash flood, Eddard knew that his place was in the north. The Greyjoys must have been told soon after, if even, with his dimmest of hopes, that they believed the truth. Any semblance of honor were to be held. Eddard knew it likely, though, how this news would be received in Pike. He'd been in the hall when Robert had boasted of Balon's 2 elder sons' deaths, and for a fleeting moment he'd felt horribly guilty for fighting for Robert as he watched as Balon's wife crumpled to the floor in unadulterated sorrow and anguish, pulling at her hair and crying for her 2 eldest sons, who would never respond. This time Balon would not take the news lying down. He would strike back, and he would strike at the north. And so he apologized to Robert that his and Jon's visit would have to be cut so short, but truly he was glad to be leaving so soon. King's Landing had not changed one bit from the last time he'd seen it, and he wanted to be gone from the city, so the ghostly visions of the rebellion would stop plaguing his waking thoughts as well as his nightmares. Not to mention before Littlefinger found a way to recover his plots against him and his house. Ned growled at the thought of the man, and was taken aback at the action when he saw Jon stare at him oddly in response. They were at the docks seeing that their men and luggage were being safely transported onto the sloop Winter's Wind, which was bound for White Harbor in a few hours' time. Just then, a messenger dressed in the Crown's stag sigil tunic arrived panting for breath. After being given some water, the exhausted young man, not much older than Jon, Eddard figured, said that the king and hand were on their way to speak with him, and they were not to leave the capital before doing so. Thanking the man for the message, Jon and Eddard walked to the far end of the dock to speak privately. "What do you think of this news, father?" asked Jon with a slight smile. Eddard knew his face turned even more grim than he usually kept it as he said, "I do not know, but I can hardly think it's good news, Jon." It was then that trumpets were heard, sounding from the entrance to announcing the royal presence, and quite soon it was seen that along with more than a few guards, Robert and Jon Arryn quickly hastened to join them at the end of the dock, saying upon arrival, "My Lord Stark, Lord Jon, it seems we've caught you just in time." Eddard didn't like how his friend referred to him by his official title, nor the emphasis he placed on the word caught. Gods had Littlefinger sprung his trap. It was then that Eddard noticed that Lord Arryn seemed troubled with a look that he had never seen on his foster father before now. It was one which spoke of grief, defeat, and utter shock. "It appears you have, your grace." If Robert wanted to play the old children's game of Lord and King when outside of his court, Ned could play it well enough himself. "Tell me, Lord Stark, is Winterfell these days safe for none but Starks?" Eddard was shocked at the outright accusation. "Excuse me, your grace," Robert moved to explain further. "More dour news from Winterfell has arrived. Your good sister is dead. Jon just informed me of 2 letters he's received confirming this information. Not just from your wife, but also her brother, Lord Admiral Tully. Lysa was dead." Eddard couldn't say he was sorry that his foster father's attempted murderer was no longer a threat, but another part of him now understood why he looked so distraught. "Rosier of Robert," groaned the old Lord Jon. And suddenly Robert's expression softened as he looked to the man who had raised him alongside of Eddard. Jon then continued with some seeming difficulty at speaking. "Edmure mentioned something in the letter I had not time to mention to you before you came to seek Ned." The king sighed before dismissively saying, "Not now, Jon." "Yes, now," insisted loudly with most of what seemed to be his remaining strength. He then gathered what remained, and in private conference between the 4 of them, read aloud from Edmure's letter of how Jon's wife had upon the ramparts of Winterfell attempted to take the life of young Rickon my son. "Gods, how could I have let that kinslayer near my pack?" And in self-defense how young Lord Robert had defended the life of his cousin, but accidentally had disrupted his mother's balance and caused her to fall from the ramparts to her death. "Lord Edmure wrote this to you?" asked Robert gravely. The old falcon was not quick to respond. "Indeed, your grace, and such knowledge greatly troubles me." "Why would the Lady Arryn attempt to kill her own nephew?" asked the young Lord Jon. The elder Jon seemed to regain some vitality as he said, "Apparently spending time in the company of wolves has inspired a change in my son, a change I admit to having desired. But I had not thought it would lead to this. Lord Edmure writes that he, Lady Catelyn, and Lord Petrek Mallister had been trying to convince her to accept the change. But she became so overwhelmed at the sight of Robert and his cousin climbing the walls of Winterfell that she lost all sense of reason, and her death is my fault. Had I not sent him away to be fostered, Lysa would still be alive and my son would not have been the cause of her demise." Eddard felt the full burden of this knowledge weigh upon him. In truth, had he not offered to have his nephew fostered at Winterfell, then Lysa would not have died, and no matter if her death did lead to the safety of Jon, clearly the man had come to care in some amount for his lady wife to be this greatly affected over the news of her death. Both Robert and Eddard were at a loss at seeing the one man who through rebellions, deaths, loss of family, and everything else they had endured, had always been as solid and stalwart as a mountain. Their mountain to cling to and find shelter in troubled times. But now before them that mountain did crack and crumble, and for the briefest of moments Eddard imagined they were yet but small children, whose innocence was being shattered upon learning that their fathers and mothers were not perfect. It was his son who finally broke the shocked silence. "Then you should come to Winterfell, Lord Arryn." Robert gave his son a look which stated he still held doubts as to the safety of Winterfell, but Jon seemed to overlook this as he continued speaking solely to the man for whom he'd been named after. "You must need fetch her bones, and surely you should want to comfort your son, should you not? I should imagine he's terribly aggrieved and distraught." The old Lord Jon seemed to grow older by the minute as he said in an almost near panic, "I can't go to Winterfell, not with war on the wind and his grace to be gathering a force to meet at Seaguard." At this, Robert seemed to summon something from deep inside of him as he proclaimed, "But you can, my Lord Arryn, for you are not well enough to continue as my hand. The realm needs a strong hand to rule in my absence while we prepare for the inevitability of another rebellion. While you have proven yourself more than capable in the past, I fear that the time for your retirement has long since arrived. Collect your wife's remains and son and return home to the Vale to raise him to be a true lord of it. And may the rest of your days be long and full of happiness as he grows up to be worthy of the honorable name of Aaron. And Eddard felt he'd ne'er heard nor would again hear his friend sound more kingly than he had in that moment. "But who would you have as your hand, your grace?" asked the elder, Lord John. Robert seemed to become more at ease, chuckling before he said, "I suppose Cersei would have me choose her father, but personally I think not. I should replace my foster father with yet another lion. Heaven knows they circle me enough already. Besides, he is near of age of you, John. I would not have you retire due to age, only to be replaced with a near peer." "Near peer? You flatter me. But you also exaggerate Lord Tywin's age. I am old enough to be his father, not his brother," exclaimed the elder John. Ned knew with how things now stood that he would not be asked to be hand by Robert, which slightly offended him at the same time it relieved him. However, he knew he had to suggest someone to keep Robert safe from the lions, as much as Littlefinger. Ned then tentatively made a suggestion. "Your Grace should consider your brother." Robert nearly growled in response. "Stannis is master of ships, and will be needed in that position in this upcoming crisis, far more than playing at being king here in the city." Robert then sighed and added, with less fury, "Though he is a good suggestion." Once again, a silence o'erfell them until yet again his adopted son broke it with, "I would suggest the Blackfish, your grace." Robert gave John a long, hard look before bursting into laughter, while jabbingly asking, "Ned, are you sure his mother isn't a Tolly?" "The boy speaks wisely, your grace. You'd not find a man more honorable, nor worthy of the position. He served me well as the keeper of the gates of the moon, which before the days of the dragons was the position equivalent to hand in the kingdom of mountain and vale," added the elder John, who seemed to recover himself slightly to say as much. Robert finally conceded, "Fine, I'll request the arrival of the Blackfish as soon as you're on this boat, John. Ned, you'll see that he arrives and leaves Winterfell without further accidents, won't you? I won't have it said of House Stark that their castle is a death trap for high lords." Ned felt the sting of offense and replied with only a slight growl underneath his voice, "You need not ask it of me, your grace. As I've said before, I would do anything to protect both you and John." Robert continued, "Indeed, you have, and I believe you." He then sighed and continued as if he didn't want to say what he was to say, but needs must say it anyway. "As for young Lord John Stark here, I believe he'll have to remain in King's Landing for a time while my brother takes him under his tutelage." John, here alone in King's Landing? Suddenly the bloody sight of Egwene and Rhaenys' bodies flashed before Eddard's eyes, along with the word dragon spawn echoing in his ears, causing him to miss what Robert had said next, leading him to say, "Pardon me, your grace." Robert then repeated himself, "I said Ned is not your son to one day be lord of the Stony Shore and commander of this great northern western fleet. He needs to learn his way about a ship before he can be of any use to you. Not to mention how to command a sailing fleet, whom better to teach him than the master of ships and the man who crushed the bloody Ironborn in the last rebellion." Eddard immediately saw through the niceties to what Robert was truly after, a hostage to be extra sure of John's life and departure from Winterfell. The effrontery of the man, how dare he even suggest separating his pup from his pack? Had he no trust anymore or belief in him anymore? But then Ned saw the hopeful look in his adoptive son's eyes, failing to see the broader implications for the opportunity to have a chance to prove himself away from the pack, which he obviously was starved for. Eddard then noted the worried look Robert gave the defeated old falcon, and he could no longer blame him as his anger largely dissipating upon the sight of Jon Arryn. The wings the old falcon had been clipped, and in such a world where that was true, the old man needed every amount of protection he could afford. And besides, Jon would have had to have gone his own way at White Harbor, with a man whom Lord Manderley had been charged to find from Braavos for much the same reasons. This way, Eddard knew that the quality of his son's seafaring education would be quite high and do the North a great honor, and better he is with Stannis than a treacherous Lannister or Redwyne admiral. So with much bitter distaste for the situation, Eddard consented to the separation and education of Jon. "Forgive me, Leia." Sansa, when father had announced that he and Jon were going to King's Landing, Sansa had panicked. Well, not at first, and not outwardly either. Instead, the panic ate away at her from the inside, slowly gnawing away at her regained sense of safety. Little by little, awful memories of Cerelyn wielding ice and Joffrey showing her father's severed head plagued her moments both when she slept and was awoke. Lady, who had been weaned from her mother about this time, had taken to following Sansa around the castle, and when she awoke from these nightmares, she'd whimper and curl up closer to her, offering the comfort of her presence. This sweet action proved to be troublesome as well, for memories of Lady's death came flowing back, causing Sansa to cry, and Lady on these occasions to affectionately lap up the tears as they fell from her cheeks. Sansa had thought that when little Sweet Robin finally came to Winterfell, that she might find a way to distract her minds from these nightmares, but Sweet Robin had instead taken to Rickon's companionship rather than her kind attentions, which Sansa thought was probably for the better for him overall, and felt right in the decision as she saw Sweet Robin become more and more of a typical little boy. Then as she had to interact with him and her aunt, the memories of all that happened in the Vale joined the constant barrages to her conscience. She heard Lysa's confession, felt Peter's kiss upon her lips, saw the snow castle representation of Winterfell destroyed again and again. Because of these nightmares and memories flooding her at every turn, she found herself unable to sleep or function that well. Sansa had given up bothering Septon Shale for continued chats on morality. She was the only one who still attended them anymore, as well as for asking him to help her in her task, copying the older books in Winterfell's library. She'd also given up the half-hearted attempt she had at trying to learn how to ward with Lady. And it was in this state that she finally recalled that it had been the king who had suggested she marry Joffrey originally, supported tremendously by her mother. Her mother wouldn't push the issue this time, but would the king? He might make it a condition of Jon's legitimization. Thus it became this issue around which Sansa could gather herself how to avoid. Unfortunately, she had recalled this important fact just after her father had left for King's Landing, which meant she had to do something in the meantime that would make her unavailable for Joffrey, should the subject arise. This meant that she would have to get married, or at the very least, betrothed, before word from her father could reach them of the king's intentions. It was a slim hope to have, but it was the only one she had to cling to at this point. She didn't like the idea in the least. Quite frankly, after having been the pawn in several successive marriage attempts and betrothals, she had been looking forward to a respite from the neck-breaking marriage market. But now, with the possibility of being betrothed once again to Joffrey a threat, this meant things had to change. And for the first time, she had a voice in seeing that change happen. Of course, she had only a little under 3 weeks to become betrothed before father arrived at King's Landing and could send word from the king. So Sansa had set to work, seeing if any of her father's local bannermen's sons would suffice. They were, after all, the most well-known to her. She approached her mother with her plan, as she'd need one of her parents' approval in order to make it a legitimate betrothal. Her mother was happy for finding an eligible young man, but found the local selection to be less than agreeable. There were 4 local bannermen's sons who would do well for Sansa, 3 of which she'd grown up playing with on occasion as a child, so she already knew them. Those 3 being Benfred Talhart, his cousin Brandon Talhart, and Clyde Sarwyn. The 4th was Darren Hornwood, but her mother dismissed the match as Alice Karstark was known to have been betrothed to Darren after she'd failed to woo Robb at the tender age of 6. Instead, having preferred Jon's sullen company. Mother, of course, also brought up the subject of Alice's 3 older brothers and her 3 cousins, in an attempt to at least give Lord Rickard some consolation in failing to have his daughter wed to Robb, but they were too far away to come in time for Sansa's liking. And frankly, Sansa did not like the idea of possibly one day marrying someone she had not the opportunity to know of their character prior to the marriage. There was just so much opportunity for that to go wrong, as her experience with Joffrey had informed her. Keep your mind on the task. Mother had been damned lucky to have gotten father. Nor did she like the idea of being a consolation prize to any man, and told her mother as much. Benfred was the heir to Torrance Square. He was older than her by 6 years, a man grown, and well built for his age, and handsome with his shaggy, sandy blonde hair that always seemed a mess. However, that age difference had always put some distance between her and the loud and often drunk Benfred, who had looked upon her as a silly little girl, not worthy of his attention because she knew nothing of battle axes and swords. He had been especially chummy with Theon Greyjoy, as Sansa recalled, so she eliminated him for that reason alone. His cousin Brandon was a year older than her. True, he was not heir, but a respectable holdfast was certainly in his future. She recalled a sweet boy who had been as different as night and day from his older cousin. He was small and lean, with short, dirty blonde hair that he always kept neatly groomed. He had been the one to play the most with her, and listen to all of her most intimate secrets of all the tall hearts. And she him. They had played at being lady and knight as children, with him rescuing her from some imagined beast, usually in the guise of Arya, who was all too willing to play the part of some monster. If it meant terrorizing Sansa, but admittedly, she could not imagine herself marrying Brandon, for she saw him in her life almost as she saw Robb or Jon. This left Tywin. Clay was a dark brown-haired and hazel-eyed boy, quite tall for his age, which was the same as Brandon Tallheart's. He was already the height of a man, grown and quite lanky because of it. As Sansa recalled last seeing him, he was all arms, legs, hands, feet, and elbows everywhere, being quite clumsy because of it, which Sansa found rather endearing in a lost puppy dog sort of way. Though he would have hated to hear such a notion attached to him. He had the makings of a decent warrior one day if he put his mind to it and filled out like the promise of his father showed. Of the three, Sansa felt she at least could come to appreciate Clay more with time. She knew him to be a polite, easygoing, and astute boy who, with age, had developed somewhat of a mischievous side, with a love for a good trick or prank. But he never was cruel about it, and he always valued a good shared laugh over feelings being hurt. And last but not least, he lived the closest of the three, at Castle Cerwyn, which was just on the other side of the White Knife, where the King's Road crossed it. Yes, she could accept Clay Cerwyn as at least her betrothed for the time being. After proposing the match to her mother, Sansa saw her mother cringe at the thought. "He's an all right boy, sweetling, but why not consider Benfred Tillhart? He's never seen me as anything but a little annoyance," protested Sansa. Her mother began. "True, but in a few years' time—" "Mother? He may like me then for my body. But what happens when my body leaves me as old as Lady Olenna? He never liked me, and that's all he'd be left when my body has dried up," countered Sansa. Her mother appeared startled to hear such words come from her daughter. "I may look 2 and 10, mother, but I assure you that inside I am still 4 and 10. I likely, if it absolutely came down to my having to marry him, I think not. I would regret it. I would prefer not to marry. All the same, but better Clay than Joffrey." Her mother still felt the need to supersede her choice. "There is still young Brandon Tallhart. I recall how close you two have been as children. It's likely you wouldn't become Lady of Torrens Square, but I always thought that the two of you held some sort of affection." Sansa did not want to repeat the same rigmarole and decided to get straight to the point. "What do you have against Lay, mother?" Her mother's attention turned to her hands before she spoke. "Once, when he was younger, I caught him tormenting Bran when he was but a babe by holding him upside down by his feet. And the tricks he pulls can be rather pointed and sting. Robb didn't particularly find the dead fish in his bed to be that good-natured. In short, I am not sure he is all that compassionate, sweetling, and with what you've had to endure. He isn't cruel. True, he can be a bit of a fool, and he japes a bit much, but beyond that, he has the makings of a fine lord one day," insisted Sansa. Her mother sighed, knowing she wouldn't get much farther with Sansa, then saying, "If you truly wish to pursue Key Cerwyn, I'm sure arranging a visit to Winterfell wouldn't be out of the question. From there, we can both judge his character." The visit, however, was delayed with everything that had happened at Winterfell. First Bran's departure, then Uncle Edmure's visit, followed by Theon's disappearance, and finally her Aunt Lysa's final demise. And now Sansa found herself once again having to serve as comforter to her sobbing small cousin Robert. The largest difference between now and then, though, was she found her young cousin did not try to nuzzle her, which she had to remind herself to thank Rickon for later. Her cousin spoke not when she held him, seeming not to have spoken to anyone but Mother or Rickon since he'd had a shaking fit atop the ramparts, after seeing his mother's body below. It was while she was in the midst of one of these silent comforting sessions with Robert that Take Cerwyn had decided to arrive at Winterfell, and Sansa was reminded of all her plans for betrothal that had completely left her. Robert hadn't wanted her to leave his side so soon, but she promised to return as soon as she could, which comforted the boy. Lozier met her outside of the Godswood gates, and immediately she saw he was different from how she remembered him. His shoulders had broadened slightly, and while he was still as lanky as he had been, he seemed to have the beginnings of muscles developing to cover the gaps, long bones exposed in his mind. He wore a tunic with a battle-axe sigil of House Cerwyn upon it. He received her with more formality than he had obviously held before, and Sansa considered that her mother had probably brought up in the discussion with his father the possibility of a marriage alliance, and thus had been told to be on his best behavior. And thus began the courtship of Sansa Stark. Jon Arryn. Jon Arryn had always known that honor was to be valued higher than any other virtue. As high as honor, his house words challenged him to meet them in his every action as he went about his business each day. This is why, when his suspicions as to the paternity of Robert's children began to take flight, Jon knew not to move until he had definitive proof. For to make the accusation without such would go against honor of both himself and the Queen, but to hold his tongue perpetually he also knew would eventually lead to him questioning his own honor. As hand, he knew that to begin a succession crisis while on the verge of rebellion would only make matters worse, so he held his tongue. He had wanted to broach the subject with Ned, but Robert never allowed for there to be a moment between them alone long enough for Jon to share such suspicions. And thus, when he was released from his obligation to Robert, he knew that his honor as ally, friend, and father figure to Robert demanded of him that the truth be known. Doing so had even lightened his spirits slightly, as he no longer focused on his own domestic troubles for the moment. He had eventually found the evidence he needed in Mallion's book, which detailed all the persons of each noble house going back to at least the days of the conquest. The evidence was simple. All those who married the Baratheon line produced Baratheon-looking children who were black of hair and blue of eye, going back all the way to Orys Baratheon himself. Most notably, a Lannister woman who'd married a Baratheon nearly a century ago had done as much. This, coupled with a summoning of Mikken the blacksmith's apprentice and the king's own memory of his natural daughter by the name of Stone, and Robert himself, was convinced of the truth in less than one telling, which was done as Jon Arryn's household emptied the Tower of the Hand and prepared to board the Winter's Wind. Events happened quite quickly after that, and at least Jon had managed to convince Robert to be subtle until the Blackfish could arrive and provide Robert's support. It had taken much to calm the furious Stag, but Jon at last had finally done it. Brynden would likely curse his name for leaving him such a scandal to clean up afterwards, but Jon knew that honor demanded nothing less of him, and the Blackfish would eventually see that. Which is why, when Tommen, Myrcella, and the blacksmith's apprentice, he intended for the boy to apprentice in the Arya and come to know his half-sister, as the boy had confided in him the desire to know his family, all boarded the ship with himself, that Ned seemed perplexed. He had spent his last few hours ashore no doubt helping his son settle in as part of Stannis' household, and spent the remainder of his time speaking to him most likely on the true nature of King's Landing. Although he oddly had boarded with a Braavosi man, it wasn't until they had set sail from King's Landing, though, that the quiet wolf approached the old falcon. "What are Princess Myrcella and Prince Tommen doing aboard ship?" asked Ned. Jon had them walk to a less occupied part of the deck, so deckhands wouldn't overhear their conversation. "Officially, I am to foster the prince and the Arya, as I did for Robert, while Myrcella is to be betrothed to my son. My son, they'll call him Kinslayer when the truth is known," and Jon felt the overwhelming grief once again darken his spirits. Ned seemed to ponder this for a moment before asking in hushed tones, "Tell me the truth, if you can." Jon was brought out of his melancholy state by this response, and he felt his own suppressed anger at this terrible situation come to the surface. "The king and I have asked the same of you, Ned, and yet you tell us nothing." Ned seemed greatly affected by this, his icy northern demeanor having since melted to some degree since they'd last met several years ago. Likely due to his Tully bride, Jon figured. It wasn't as much as, say, a true Southron would show, but for a northerner he was now rather expressive. For the first time since Ned's childhood, Jon could clearly read the slight emotions hinted at by his face, seeing that Ned was feeling reproachful with himself over concealing however he'd come to learn of the assassination attempt. Finally, after some silence, Ned said, "You wouldn't believe the truth if I told you. It is far too fantastical. Then we are at an impasse, for I think it unlikely for you to believe the truth from me." And Jon left Ned with the hopes that his words would gnaw away his former ward's resolve, like it always had when he'd lived in the Eyrie. And so they remained silent in each other's company for a time. Jon thought it a blessing, as it gave him time to consider what he would tell his sworn lords about Lysa's death. He couldn't risk letting the truth be known. They'd demand Robert to be tried for murder, even if it was an accident, and then his son would be disinherited. The issue of inheritance was fragile in the Vale, all because he had failed in his husbandly duties, except with the example of young Robert. Thus the land was ripe for inheritance games. not seen in Westeros since the time of the 5 she-wolves of Winterfell, almost a century earlier. Jon was sure if his sworn lords could find a reasonable excuse to cut his branch down so that a better arrangement with other claimants could be put in his son's place, they would do it. This then left but 2 rival factions to contest for inheritance of the Eyrie and the Vale. Harry the heir and the Arryns of Gulltown, led by his distant cousin Wallis. Harry would have the better claim as his sister's grandson, but it would be foolish of the lesser Arryns to not attempt to stage some kind of coup by buying support. The 7 knew they were rich enough from their involvement in trade. So the truth could not be known. But where was the honor in lying to his sworn lords about the death of his wife? Well, saying that it had been an accident was truth enough, but leaving out that Robert had been the those of that accident. There was little honor and seemed rather underhanded and manipulative. An Arryn should soar above the dirty world of politics, and yet had he not had to trek the muddy world of politics as hand, but that was as hand now as the Lord Paramount of the Vale. He had a higher standard of honor to uphold. His father Jasper had always maintained that it was the Arryns, the oldest and most pure-blooded of all the Andal houses, that had to set an example for other houses to follow. Where is the honorable way with which to solve this problem, father? This subject further troubled Jon so that he found neither sleep nor respite on the ship. It was upon the 9th day of the voyage that Ned finally spoke to Jon, saying, "I will tell you what I can, for it is not my story to tell." What followed was several hours of discussion of the most unbelievable of subjects. He wove a story of his 4 youngest children having traversed time from a different future, one of blood and civil wars and horrors all too imaginable for the old falcon. One where deaths of all those they loved came and villains ruled with little consequence. Jon was shocked by what he heard, so that he said, "You know not of what you speak." Ned, to his credit, admitted, "I knew not what to believe myself at first." "So you warned me of possible assassination all on the word of your children? An assassination that had been proven true, it seemed, but Jon put that aside for the moment, though taking note of it. Ned here became rather fatherly. "My children spoke far too truthfully for it to not be so, and spoke of things they would not jape about, like mine and their mother's deaths." Jon was taken aback by such an admission for a moment, but still felt curious as to what had made Ned believe this giant story. "What specifically convinced you?" Ned met his eyes, saying Sansa could describe the Eyrie perfectly. Not just the castle itself, but other things as well. Things you could only know if you had lived there. And since I knew she has not left the North in this life, then what other option could there be? Jon thought of a few personal account of the history of the Kingdom of the Mountain and Vale, the memoirs of one of its former inhabitants. But then he wondered if the girl would have had access to them given the North's disinterest in everything south of the Neck. Finally, he said, "I will have to hear her words myself then, to know the truth for certain." Ned nodded his head, and then asked, "So, tell me why Robert is making his own children to be hostages." Jon smiled, knowing Ned, unfortunately, could be rather predictable in his thoughts he shared. "Now I must share," and then he said, "Ned, have you ever met Maya Stone?" Ned looked at him with some bewilderment before nodding. "And I know you have been speaking with young Gendry." Ned, like always, cut to the point rather than drift on the wind. "Is he Robert's as well?" Jon snorted while saying, "Need you ask the question?" "Looking at him brings back many memories," Ned said fondly. "Aye, it does, at better times than the one we live in today." And then he told him the truth, as he knew it, of the fact that no Baratheon had yet sired a child for it, not to be born, black of hair and blue of eye. And the last Lannister woman and Baratheon man had most certainly not produced children of the Lannister looks. Ned immediately froze at hearing of the discovery. He spoke with a frosty conviction. "We must go back, Jon. Robert will not wait for the Blackfish to arrive. No, I made him swear on his crown and love for me that he would not move without support." Ned cut through his belief like a sword. When has Robert ever kept a vow he ever swore? Suddenly Jon felt a cold dread as he realized what Ned had already. Fury meant more to a Baratheon than claims of honor, and Robert knew him enough to have used his Arryn honor against him. He swore that to make me leave and protect me. The damned fool. And then a deckhand interrupted them. "Me lords, you must go neath deck. The gods have not given us a favorable voyage, it seems, to judge by those clouds." Jon looked to the horizon and saw the black clouds, which seemed to draw ever closer. The wind seemed to pick up, and he heard a distant rumble. A storm, there'd be no turning back now. They'd be lucky to yet live. Where's he at? Father and Jon were a week late in returning, and there had been no news from King's Landing, since 2 raven-carrying messages from Uncle Jon and Father had arrived, telling them that the king had legitimized Jon, that he had received word of Theon's death, that he and Jon were taking the next available ship home, and asking for Robb to call his bannermen that were not on the western coast to Winterfell. Make doubly sure that Moat Cailin was reinforced, and to turn the north into an impenetrable fortress. Uncle Jon's message merely stated he was joining Father in coming north to collect his wife's remains and take his son back to the Vale. And the entire time Arya regretted that her father had talked her into staying and protecting Mother and the family. He'd caught her with Needle. She had been so excited to receive the sword once again from Jon that she'd forgotten to hide it. Father then forced the truth out of her soon enough. Suddenly, her story seemed to make more sense to him, and then he reminded her that Aunt Lysa wasn't to be trusted. He used her mistrust of her aunt to persuade her to stay. In return, she had asked that he hire Syrio while in King's Landing so that she could continue her training, swearing that she would not come if he did so. She hated those words now. Lysa had died from her own foolishness, and here she was sitting here in Winterfell, while Father and Jon could have been taken hostage, or worse, their boat could have sunk. The narrow sea was typically calm, but as winter approached, she had heard it said that more and more storms would appear. What was the worst part of this was the waiting for information. Everyone in Winterfell was waiting. Uncle Edmure was even still in the north, waiting for Jon Arryn to arrive so a proper memorial could be performed for Aunt Lysa before taking her bones back to the Vale. As his letter to Winterfell had mentioned, Willa Manderly had not been a great comfort during all of this. She instead had decided to pester Ear with questions about Jon, asking her what his favorite color was, and other such nonsense. That is, it seemed like nonsense, until Arya discovered that the green-haired girl dyed her hair to the stark gray she'd japed was his favorite color. After realizing that Willa's interest in her brother might be for other reasons than plain curiosity, Arya was careful about which questions she answered and how she did so. Between Uncle Edmure, his friends, and the bannermen from the north and the east, who arrived day by day over the month from the receipt of Father's letter, the wine and ale cellar was slowly emptied, much to Mother's annoyance. And then at long last, a raven did arrive. It came from Barrowton, reporting that Ironborn had come up the Barrow River and were likely to take the town. At this point, only the Tallhearts, led by a reluctant to return Benfred, who had somehow acquired his own black eye, his young cousin Brandon appearing on his own a few days after, and the Serwins, led by Clay's father Medger, had arrived at Winterfell. The Hornwoods were likely to appear any day. Robb, in response, decided to send some of House Tallheart's forces, as half of a pincher moved to hopefully relieve the siege, or if it had fallen, retake Barrowton. At first, Benfred refused to follow Robb's command and lead the relief force. Benfred didn't even attempt to hide the animosity in his voice as he said, "Lord Stark should return soon, and he may have a better idea." The insult hung in the air between Benfred and Robb for a moment. Robb then merely looked to Grey Wind, who had grown to the size of a full-grown dog by this point, and the wolf reminded Benfred just what questioning loyalty to House Stark entailed. Father always said that the North follows strength. I can't afford to look weak. One day I shall be Lord of Winterfell, and they'll look back on these few weeks to see what kind of lord I'll be. If I can't show them that I'm strong now, the noble houses will never listen to me when I inherit, he had said when Arya had asked him why he'd had Grey Wind bite a few of Benfred's fingers off the hand which did not wield the sword. Robb then told Benfred that his cousin Brandon would instead lead the force from Torrens Square south. The eager boy jumped at the opportunity and accepted immediately, much to everyone's surprise. Robb later had told Arya that he had made the offer to further shame Benfred into accepting. He had wanted to tell the boy that he was too young to lead an army. But Robb thought better of it, for he himself was hardly older than Brandon, and he had planned to lead some Serwyn and Winterfell forces south along the King's Road, and then west to approach Barrowton as the other half of the Pincher move. Later, Arya overheard Sansa speaking with Brandon alone in the Godswood while she was praying for Father's and Jon's safe return. Sansa's voice traveled clearly through the trees as she asked, "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" Brandon's voice was softer, but Arya could hear him growl in response, "You don't understand what it's like to be a son of a second son." Sansa had to nearly beg him to speak. "Then tell me, talk to me, please." Brandon's voice finally burst out, "I've got next to nothing promised to me. What about that little holdfast you always were bragging about? That's not likely to happen anymore." And Arya heard him kick a tree in response. What happened? He asked her as if he expected her to know without him telling her. You do know that Benfred and Robb had a falling out over Theang, right? He still has the black eye, Sansa answered calmly. Well, I gave Benfred his own, and I refused to apologize. Uncle said that I'll never get so much as a grain of sand on Evergreen Lake from him until I do, and I'm not going to, not ever. So you see, I have to do something to make a name for myself. But leading an army? Asked Sansa incredulously. Brandon cynically snorted. Why not? Haven't I been training for just that possibility? War isn't a game, Brandon. People die, insisted Sansa. Brandon laughed and replied, I, the enemy. A silence fell between them for a moment before Sansa finally asked, For what reason did you punch your cousin? I thought that'd be obvious, responded Brandon coolly. Sansa was speechless for a few moments before saying, What are you trying to say? It was Brandon's turn to be speechless. He finally did say, You don't see it, do you, Brandon? He shouted, Why don't you just go back to Clay? And Arya heard the boy march off through the Godswood. After Robb and Brandon Tallheart had each departed, leaving Rickon the Stark in Winterfell, another raven arrived from Bear Island, reporting of Ironborn blockading and sieging the island, though not successfully. Deepwood Motte and Relshal both reported that, though they had been under siege but had thrown the Ironborn forces off after a few days, Moat Cailin eventually reported of the neck being stained red with the blood of Ironborn, and that any who had not been killed had fled. Flint's Finger reported that the Ironborn controlled the Salt Spear in Blazewater Bay, though any attack on the Finger itself was made nearly impossible by the cliffs. Wyman Manderley, who had stayed behind in White Harbor while sending his knightly son with some of his forces, reported that the new fleet had nearly been acquired or built, with no news of the winter's wind. The North was at war, and Father John and Uncle John likely lost at sea. Benjen, he was running for his life. He, along with 4 other brothers of the Night's Watch, had been sent to find Waymar Royce and his party. Instead, as they drew to the borders of the lands of Always Winter, he'd come across creatures he'd only heard tell of in old man's tales, when he had been the pup whose swords had made his break in two. Fleeingly as he continued to run for his life, away from the silent others, Benjen wondered if Old Nan were still living. And suddenly in his mind he was back in Winterfell, hearing Old Nan tell the tale of the last hero, her words comforting him as he remembered the tale. He did not, however, let Old Nan's tale distract him from his run. Instead, he let the warm memories of his childhood fuel his desire to keep running, to make it back to the wall, so that they would know. They had to know, so that they could prepare, so that Winterfell could prepare, so that his brother and his family could prepare. And suddenly, out of nowhere in front of him, one of the others appeared from behind a tree. He veered to the right, and then yet another appeared. He went for his left, and another made its presence known. More appeared until he was completely surrounded. Benjen knew in that moment he was done for. He, however, would not go down without a fight, and so, with his broken sword piece, he attempted to hack and slash his way out of the circle of ice swords waiting to strike him. But all that got him was his sword fracturing even more and an empty hilt with which to fight. The others seemed to enjoy taunting him in these final moments, scaring him with the thought of death as one and then another would threaten to come and end it all, but pull back when they saw him flinch or move to dodge. He did not show any fear, though he certainly felt it. He would die a Stark, even if all he had was his sword hilt to defend himself with. One of them finally swung at his right leg with one of their swords, causing him to fall to the ground as he felt a chill strike him deep to the bone, as the great ice sword hit, just as he was about to assume that there would be no escaping the god's price. From out of the darkness, then came a sight he'd ne'er seen before, a Night's Watch man bestride a great elk. As he approached, he carried with him a spear, readying to strike the nearest other that dared charge him. A few indeed did run to meet his challenge, only to be speared or be distracted by a flock of ravens which barraged them, most missing the swipes of the ice swords, and the few that did falling to the snow, dead. Benjen watched, expecting his final moment to be of this foolish man meeting his own doom, but as the spear pierced the other something rather peculiar occurred. It screamed in utter agony and melted. Another other attempted to flank him on the side without a spear, but a small dagger in his other hand soon appeared and it burrowed into its flesh, and that other melted as well. Benjen was in awe as the figure dressed in mottled black and faded gray slew several more others, their ice swords seeming to have little effect on when they slashed at him, though it frightened his beast. Eventually, a small number of others remained that became frightened and ran from the man in black, leaving Benjen to him. Benjen tried to pull himself up, but found it difficult with his leg as badly hit as it was. The man dismounted, and as he approached Benjen, saw that the man wore a black scarf over his face, and the man's face wasn't obscured by just the hood as he'd assumed earlier. This man did not want to be seen, but what nearly scared him was when he saw no breath like his emanate from where the mouth should be. But then Benjen thought it to be held behind the scarf, for how could the man move and not breathe? Finally, he spoke in a rattling voice. "Are you badly injured?" Benjen found himself unable to formulate words for a moment, and deciding to show a strong front and not be the pup he had retreated to in his mind before the others had outwitted him, and he shook his head. The man did not respond at first, merely kneeling down to examine the wound that the ice sword had left on his leg. Finally, Benjen found the strength in himself to ask, "Who are you, brother?" The masked figure did not answer, instead standing and saying, "Come, your watch is not complete, and you are required elsewhere." He offered his hand to help Benjen up to his feet. As he took it, he found them to be the coldest hands he'd ever felt. "Yaxley, fee. 6 stags," insisted Clive for what felt like the umpteenth time. He had not dragged that blasted 15-pound salt rock. As he had entered the market of the village earlier, various people had slowly begun to congregate around him. Some trying to quietly break off a piece if they thought they could get away with doing so by offering to help him carry the damnable thing. Others simply to watch as he set about haggling with the old gamekeeper of House Shore, who were the local lords of the village and its surrounding domains. The gamekeeper needed to restock on salt in order to preserve the game caught for the winter everyone expected to come either this coming year or the next. Clive had learned from his experience with the Redcliffe family, whose lands bordered the shores, that to undersell his and Nella's hard work would only beget a hungry stomach, and she likely being with child it was only a little over a moon, but it seemed less and less likely she would get her moon's blood. He couldn't afford to have her go hungry. "5," responded the red-bearded gamekeeper, still coolly as ever. The only thing notable about the man was the fact his beard was red where the rest of his hair was as brown as the mud caked to their boots. The crowd hackled the man's stubbornness, and Clive smirked, feeling that if he didn't get a good bargain out of this deal, they'd overcharge the gamekeeper from here on out. "6," punctuated Clive with his fist slamming on the table at which they sat to bargain. The bargain table, as it was called. It was there for those too poor to own a stand were to come and sell their wares, like Neela had done long before he'd arrived. It was in the unfavorable location of the market, the muddiest spot and the one closest to the commons where the stench of the livestock wafted ripely in the air. He shook his head, his ratty brown hair too greasy to bounce as he did. 5. Clive finally decided to make his move that, God's willing, would see him through. 7. The man responded without thinking, just like he thought he would. 6. "Done," exclaimed Clive triumphantly, and the crowd applauded his winnings. Clive, however, scanned the crowd looking for her and saw her leaning against the post of a nearby stand, watching from afar with her trademark hooded cloak she never let down when in the village. The gamekeeper, too, full of honor and outnumbered to squelch at the moment, pulled out his coin purse and gave the appropriate amount. Clive, having sold all his and Nella's wares for the day, collected it all in his own purse and handed the man his salt rock. As the crowd dispersed, returning to their business, Clive proudly strutted over to Nella and moved to greet her with a kiss. She shied away from his advances, insisting that she didn't want anyone to see them. "Are you ashamed of me?" asked Clive. Her eyes grew wide as she looked at him, and then insisted, "Never. But people will see my face." She was talking about that ridiculous scar. When he'd first seen it, he had been repelled by it for a reason. He couldn't recall. Something nagged at him that he was supposed to run, flee from the gray flaky skin. But the why completely escaped him. And as he had come to be nursed by Nella and come to touch her, he had grown to rather like her crescent-shaped gray scar. It was like a new moon to him, promising him many new and unknown things that this life brought him. The old was gone, and ne'er to return, he hoped. Though why he hoped as much he knew not. As they left the village upon the narrow dirt path which led back to the steep cliffs they carved their lives from, he continued to try and persuade her to drop the hood, but she rebuffed him with increasing reluctance. Each time until they came to top of the cliffs, where he finally succeeded with the sun setting on the waters of the Salt Spear, and the sound of the waves lapping the shore below to give the scene a certain splendor. Unfortunately, after that kiss, he'd suggested they continue this back in their stone hut along the shore. Oh, that they had stayed there in that moment for perpetuity. But alas, his desire to have her and hers him had led to the climbing down the steep but not unmanageable descent down the cliff. As their descent rounded the side of an outcrop that blocked their view of the cottage from the top of the cliff, it is when Clef felt a chill overtake him. Ironborn, they were a plague up and down the salt spear, striking and raiding at random. Clef had thought that their small hut would have been passed over in hopes of hitting more wealthy targets, but by how he saw their belongings being thrown out the door to the hut, he knew that these were desperate reapers, probably looking for food. Go back to the village, tell everyone. He wanted her and his seed within her out of danger. Then he'd strike. She grasped his arm, holding him back. I'm not leaving without you. He would have to remind her. Argue not, Nyala. Think of the babe. She only held on tighter. He'd have to lie. Go, I'll be right after. And her decision was taken from her as suddenly a shout was heard below, and the reapers charged to their position. Nyla instinctively ran, and Clax turned and blocked the ascending men. His fists were his only weapons as he charged with the hopes of giving Nyla enough time to escape. Devas, the Onion Knight, his greatest feat that had earned him his greatest reward, and cost him dearly. Nonetheless, as he flexed his half-fingered left hand, he thought it well worth it, Stannis Baratheon, who had taken the first joint from each of his fingers for smuggling, but left him the rest of his hand and gave him land and status for smuggling supplies into Storm's End. When it was under siege, was a tough man, but a good one. Stannis could perhaps be blinded to the fact that not every man was like himself. Though, and despite having lived 33 years, Davos thought Stannis still belabored under the impression that others ought to be more like him, or at least endeavored to do so if they were not, like Davos did. Davos, meanwhile, from his years of smuggling, had learned that this was not a detriment, but often a hidden blessing to keep the long voyages interesting. He also found it a challenge to figure out the blind spots of a potential foe or purchaser reading. A person so unlike you and outwitting them was half the sport in smuggling. But since he'd become a knight with honor like his lieges, he had tried to put that aside, though he still recalled it enough to try and make use of the skill if the situation called for it. And this was a situation which called for it. His latest orders from the king were that he were to take in the legitimized bastard son of Eddard Stark, on whom Stannis held a slight grudge for receiving praise at relieving the siege at Storm's End, while Stannis had received no thanks whatsoever in even holding Storm's End at all. I know not why my brother continues to insult me in this manner, he huffed a little loudly from his solar of his private house in the capital that he took use of when staying in King's Landing on business as master of ships. The king, his brother, seemed to think that since Stannis' seat at Dragonstone were but an easy journey for his brother, it not necessary to provide accommodations within the Red Keep itself, which further strained the relations between the two men. I think he has done you a great service, my lord. Do you, in that habit of Stannis's for grinding his teeth, made an appearance? Indeed, did not this boy earn his legitimization through the preservation of the life of his true-born siblings, or did the rumors speak falsely? Davos had heard the stories rumored all through. Stannis admitted gruffly, it is what was proclaimed. Then it appears your brother can recognize when two people might have enough in common. Mayhaps this son of Lord Stark's likewise holds to your opinion on the value of getting what one earns. I'll soon discover this for myself. If he be all that, Lord Stark's arrival at the great house with his legitimized son occurred scarcely after the arrival of the letter. Never had Davos seen a son look so alike his father, and he could easily see why the Lord would take the child in and raise him alongside his true-born children, whom Davos had heard tell of more resembled their mother than him. The boy came dressed in Stark colors, but with the inverse colors of his sigil in the form of his full-grown pet dog. Aye, if the Lord had seen to giving him such a pet, he truly did favor the boy. After the Lord and his son's heartfelt departure, the young man reported to Stannis like a young sailor might before his captain. In these first moments, the boy made a favorable impression upon Davos. In many ways, actually, the boy reminded him of a younger and slightly more vulnerable version of Stannis he had met when he first had come under his employ. That siege had toughened Stannis to hard-wrought steel. In that moment, wondered if the same fate lay in store for Jon Stark, under Stannis' supervision. Neither the boy nor Stannis spoke at first, both simply staring at one another and trying to read each other from across the room before. Davos felt both were likely to make wrong impressions of the other, if allowed to continue on in this silence. At long last, Stannis finally broke the silence. I have been commanded by his grace, my brother, to take you on as a ward and teach you the ways of ship and sea. His Grace suggested as much to my father, my lord, after my lord father told him of his plans, that he would like for me one day to have the ability to lead a navy. The king even complimented your skill. That's a lie. I will not tolerate lies to be spoken in my presence. My brother never compliments myself. I speak truly, my lord. To quote him, he said to my lord father, whom better to teach your son than the man who destroyed the Iron Fleet. Davos noticed that news of his brother's regard for his naval prowess did not please the man, likely because he heard it not from the man himself, but through another. Despite his steel exterior, Davos could see it through his lord to the child he had, like been before he'd met him. A second son, always desiring a way for recognition, only to never receiving it, contenting himself to the lesson he should not desire recognition for his achievements, though he did. Looking to his elder brother's recognition once his parents had died, Stannis most likely thought that child long dead, starved out of affection during the siege, but Davos could still catch hints of its minimal existence from time to time. Now was one of those times. Do you yourself believe what my brother has told you? Aye, my lord. I learned all about your plan of Fair Isle and capture of Old Wake in my lessons as a child. You are still a child, boy, if you think that I myself did not destroy the Iron Fleet alone, and would not have it said so. I had the support of all the captains sworn to me, whom put their trust in me as their commander to lead them true. This I did, but without the loyalty and respect of those captains, such as Sir Davos here, I am sure you would have heard a very different story from my brother's lips. Never undervalue the contributions of others. Do you understand me, boy? Davos noticed within the lad a slight bristle at being called boy, but he was smart enough not to make mention of the offense, and merely nodded in agreement. What do you know about a ship? You tie a sail to a mast, and the wind pushes it across the waves, my lord. Stannis did not seem amused at the cheek of the Stark and said as much. He then rose and walked over to one of the shelves of books along the walls of his house, and looking for a title, eventually pulled out one and tossed it to the lad, who caught it. I presume you know how to read, boy. Why wouldn't I, my lord? The boy took offense at the suggestion he might be unable. Monsieur Davos here cannot read, though he is not so well sired as you. Once you have read this book in its entirety from cover to cover and can satisfy to me your knowledge, I will then take over your instruction. Until that time, Sir Davos here shall take you aboard his vessel. I'm to live aboard ship? Asked the boy incredulously. Stannis snorted slightly before saying darkly, Where else do you think to learn about one, 'neath the ground? It was then that they were interrupted by a messenger from the king, who delivered a written message. Stannis read the lines on the page with ease, and then took himself aside to speak with him in some sense of privacy. Sir Davos, I need not remind you to see to it that he earns his right to stay aboard the ship. No, my lord, replied Davos. Keep the boy close. Don't let him out of your sight. I have been summoned by my brother to the palace on most urgent business. I will see you on the morrow to hear more of the lad. And with that said, Lord Stannis dismissed them. Davos then took the boy and his few belongings down to the docks, the white dog following loyally behind them as they did so. As they walked through the streets of the city, Davos observed to the boy, You'll have to leave the dog, boy. He'll be a distraction aboard ship. The lad was determined. Ghost stays with me, and he is no dog. Davos put aside the lad's refusal to part with his pet, it reminding him of his own son's stubbornness at first, and deciding to return to it at a later point. Instead, he asked, What is he then? A wolf? The boy elucidated as they dodged the crowded streets. I, a dire wolf, the living embodiment of my house's sigil. All my siblings have one. A gigantic she-wolf was found in the Wolfswood and came to Winterfell to give birth to a litter. Queer tale to explain a dog to a boy. But Davos decided that he'd allow the lad some vestige of his family. He'd want his sons to have as much. Doubting the nature of the beast, though, he simply added, I heard they were larger. He is just a pup, was the lad's only reply. Then deciding that if the boy truly wanted his pet aboard, he'd give him his first test. If he grows any larger, you'll have to cut your rations to feed him, or work twice as much to earn his place aboard ship. I will work and so will he, was the boy's stoic response. Davos chuckled at the thought, a dog earn his keep. He would love to see that day. But the boy had replied rightly, though it remained to be seen if there was more than just wind behind his words. Good-naturedly, he added, I believe you will. After finding Jon Stark a hammock to sleep in below decks, he then set a bucket and brush before the boy and told him that his first lesson about ships would be in maintenance. A ship is only as good as her weakest part. And when a ship has been sitting at port is when she is the most vulnerable to damages and disrepair. Ships are not made for port, and fare not well in them, for it is not so much the use of a ship's parts, but the underuse of them which wears them out the quickest. Before setting sail, you must always check that every part is in good working order. For once you have left port, if anything were to break on your journey, it could mean life or death out there on the seas. You understand, boy? The lad was, if anything, respectful as he said, "Aye, sir. The first step to maintaining a good ship is cleanliness. Now, I want you to scrub the rear deck before this evening's meal. Were you working alone? I'd ask for only half, but since you have your wolf to help you, I see no reason why it should take you two any more time than it would to do half as much." He then left the lad and his pet at it, while he met with his second-in-command, his son Matas, who informed him of the status of the ship in his own compartments. "Who's the boy?" asked his dark-haired son as he took a seat. Davos had offered. "He's Lord Stark's legitimized bastard. Apparently he is to learn about ships with Lord Stannis, so he might one day be an admiral of his father's ships." Mathos looked confused at this news. "The North has a fleet?" "Apparently it will," said Davos. Just then, a deckhand came to them to announce that 2 gold cloaks had boarded without permission, requiring his presence atop deck to speak with him. Davos immediately wondered what the gold cloaks could be desire of him. He soon found the 2 men who looked little better than thugs with cloth of gold drabbed from their armor. "Captain Davos, by the order of the Queen, the traitor Lord Stannis' ward, Jon Stark is required to come with us." Traitor? Just exactly what had happened in the Red Keep in the last few hours. Davos shot subtle looks to his deckhands, telling them to be ready at a moment's notice. He would not fail his lord's command to keep the boy, especially if the Queen was falsely accusing his liege a traitor. It had to be false. Stannis would not move against his brother. The Queen must have seized power. In the meanwhile, he bought his deckhands some time by continuing to drag out the conversation. "Sirs, you are aware that I am under command to see to it that his ward begins his naval education. Do you not? He may continue it ashore. The Queen desires the boy, Captain." "When does the Queen order gold cloaks? What has happened to the King?" "The King has taken ill. It appears the Targaryen legacy lives through him and his treacherous brothers. The boy, Captain." Upon hearing that, Davos gave the signal and his deckhands took the gold cloaks by surprise, knocking them out with only a little bit of a scuffle. They then unceremoniously tossed them into the waters of the bay. These would not be the only men, there would be more of them. And if they reported true, the Lord Stannis was a prisoner of the Red Keep. He could hardly sneak into the keep with his deckhands, nor could he stay in port a moment longer before likely joining his lord in where the Queen had placed him. And then who would come to his lord's aid? Or tell the world of her unjust claims? He'd have to sail for Dragonstone and gather the support of Lady Saresta the fleet, and then he would return for his lord.
Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this reimagined story and audiobook style presentation, feel free to like and subscribe for more content like this. New stories and alternate scenarios are updated regularly. Now see you in the next video.